Hello, everyone, and welcome to Level Up 2021, and welcome to the How to Operate Games Forever panel in a discussion I know is going to be very interesting to everybody. And with us to speak on these topics, we have first Ken Go, CEO of DECA Games and now part of the Embracer Group. DECA has been live operating old school free-to-play mobile titles such as Knights and Dragons, Modern War, and Dragonvale, so I have a lot of experience there. Next, we have Drew Levin, lead PM at Zynga, who works on the Zynga Forever franchise Words with Friends, which originally launched in 2009. And finally, we have Payton Orr, product manager at Socialpoint, working on Dragon City, which launched in 2012. As many of you know, some of these games are even 10 years later, showing extremely strong performance and in fact, fairly steady performance for the past 5+ years. And so the first question I wanted to ask our panelists is in terms of the games that have been operating for a prolonged period of time, how do you guys think about game extensibility? In other words, what are some of the key considerations being able to ensure that games can continue to engage players over a long period of time? And maybe since you're first in my window here, Payton, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, sure thing. So for Dragon City, there's a couple of big factors that we talk about a lot. One of which is kind of the most obvious one, which is just having a lot of content, consistent content, and especially really strong, consistent live ops events. So in Dragon City, we're very aggressive about our live ops events. We have 5 to 7 small mini games every month. We're releasing 10 to 15 dragons a month. We make sure there's enough new content for the late game users to feel engaged, as well as keeping the early funnel, fresh and exciting for new players to come in. So that's a big one. We also talk a lot about having a high performance team. A game that has been running for this long, you can run into stagnation, not just in the product, but in the processes. And, having a team that can run really autonomously, that's always challenging each other and challenging the processes, is a really huge part of keeping a game operating for this long. There's also the factors of things like technical stability. So old games, you guys all probably know the pains of having tech debt and running into things that were ancient from back in when the game only operated on Facebook and things like that. So we are always working on improving our tools, improving our technical stability in the game. And then lastly, we think about marketing. So making sure that the game is very visible for new users, that we're doing a really innovative and cross, platform marketing campaign to make sure that we're acquiring users continuously over the years and keep the game, fresh and maintained.
Got it. Drew?
So I think Payton touched on a lot of good frameworks. I'm going to use a bunch of them and then add a few of my own. So obviously growth is important, right? You don't get to have a game that's successful for this long without having some kind of audience, preferably millions of people who want to come back and play your game every day or every week, every month, sort of continuing on for a really long time. These are people that get a lot out of your game. You need to understand them. You need to sort of figure out what motivates them. For Dragon City, that's content. For Words with Friends, it's a little bit different. It's around skill, belief, and progression. And so figuring out how you give people something that really, makes them feel like they're getting better at the game, even when they've been playing for 5-10 years. And so for Words with Friends, that's, this sort of anagramming puzzle game that you're playing against someone. It also has to do with something a lot more social, right? Words are with friends. And so a lot of what we see about our game is people stay for the relationships. They come for the game, they stay for their friends. And finding ways to make those connections more meaningful and give people a greater sense of connectedness is a huge part of what Words with Friends relies on for longevity, and really Zynga relies on for the success of a lot of its titles.
All right, Ken?
I think Drew and Payton, they covered a lot of it. The only thing that I would just add there is for many games, community is actually very important. So you have the game itself, and then you have everything around the game. So I think, Drew and Payton talked a lot about what you do inside the game, but for many games, this idea of not just playing the game and all the levels inside of it, but interacting with the rest of the players and making even a meta experience outside of the game with the other players that you've made. You have all these stories about people, making friends, getting married, spending days and days in games, not just playing the games, but actually just hanging out, chatting, and hanging out like you would with any other person in real life, but around the game that they've been playing for many years.
And Ken, when you try to build community in your games, do you do that through chat and by developing things like forums and Reddit and Discord communities, or are there other things that game developers should be thinking about?
Our approach has been that community is sort of emergent, that you cannot necessarily force it. You can foster it, and then you grow it where the players want to grow it. So you let them lead the community, and then you just help them out and facilitate. But if you're talking about a mobile game, I think Reddit and Discord are two places where you can't go wrong. I'm not as big a fan of like building up your own forum and trying to push that onto your players, because it might not be the best format for a mobile experience. It also might not be where your players are already. So we try to take the community to the players where they're already happening. And many times that's happening outside of things that you control or that you can see. And then the players will tell you where is it that they want to live, where they are interacting, and you try to go to them.
Okay. And Payton, one of the things that you mentioned is a high performance team. And so the way that you view your team, how are you thinking about developing this high performance team, or what does that mean specifically in terms of live ops? Are there specific roles that you're looking for? Are there specific characteristics or attributes that you're looking for in your team?
Yeah, so for us, when we think of a high performance team, we're really thinking of a team that's very adaptable, very flexible. They're able to take on challenges and obstacles and adapt really quickly to fix them. And also people who you can basically pull anyone out of the team and the team will still function as a whole, right? So the teams we're looking for, if suddenly half of us go out on vacation, we can adjust our roadmap. We can, make sure that our features are still moving forward. The team doesn't get caught up or confused or anything like that, right? So everybody is very on top of things and they understand what's going on with the other disciplines and they're able to adjust quickly. And that's something that's super important for a big game like this with big features and a lot of tech debt and all that stuff. You've got to learn to be quick and agile in adjusting to whatever comes up.
Right. And Payton, you had also mentioned that content was very important, having a lot of content for your players. And Drew, I know you mentioned understanding your players. So I thought we could next talk about content cadence and the kind of content that you deliver to your players. So when you're thinking about, the type of events, the amount of content, just wondering if you guys could give us a high level framework or way of thinking about the types of content and the cadence of content that you deliver to your players. And maybe starting with you, Drew.
Sure. So we've actually been experimenting a lot with this on Words with Friends. We recently added a battle pass style system to our game. One of the things that really drove that was an understanding that our players do want sort of meaningful goals and things that they can accomplish at every sort of period of time, right? So they want things that they can complete and feel effective about within a session, within a day, a week, a month, and multiple months and multiple years. And so when you think about sort of layering in your systems, you have to figure out, are you covering all of the things that are going to make your players feel successful and give them something meaningful to do over all of those periods of times? And so our content needs to cover not just novelty, not just skill, but also periods of time as well.
Okay. Ken, go. What about you?
I think general rule is you can almost never have too much content. Content is king, but there's always some caveats to that. You don't want to fatigue your player base, and you don't want to reduce the value of any individual piece of content unnecessarily, so that you want, when you're doing a content drop or content release, you want the players to get excited. You want them to be happy. You want them to anticipate it. And so if you do that too often, it can lose its value. So if you think about it from, the traditional physical merchandise that you might be selling, something that has high value and highly anticipated, like sneakers, like, limited time sneakers. If you have that every day of the year, something dropping, it tends to lose that value. So you have to keep that in mind, and you have to understand the player base to understand what is the right balance. So you're going to have some segment of players that will buy every single thing that you put out, and you're going to have the rest of the players that are maybe not able to spend that much and to buy every single thing that you put out, and also are not expecting it to be all the time. So you want them to feel like what they've purchased, they've gotten what the money, like a fair value for what they put into it. So if you release too much stuff too quickly, you might reduce that value, and also might seem unfair to the players who aren't always able to, participate in every single piece of content. So just some other things to keep in mind.
Okay. And Payton, what about you on Dragon City?
Sure. Yeah, I think Ken made some really good points. One other thing for us is just always, I think Drew kind of mentioned this, always testing and seeing whether your assumptions that you have are actually correct about the players, right? So for instance, with Dragon City, we had a firm cadence of how often we release dragons, but we're always questioning, is that necessary? Is that why people are engaging in these certain events? We have 1,500 almost dragons in the game right now, right? Are those 10, 15 new dragons every event or every month really what's creating the excitement around those events? Or is it the way the events are balanced? Or is it the cadence of the events themselves that's really driving it? So we like to A/B test things. We like to change things up every once in a while and see how the players respond, both from a community standpoint, as Ken pointed out, and also just behind the scenes, like what the data is telling us about that content. Because obviously any effort that you put into creating new content like dragons or a new event or something it's resourcing that you could be putting towards other areas of the game. And you always want to make sure that you're maintaining a good balance.
Right. And I know all three of you are working on games that have kind of stood the test of time, have been operating for many, many years. And so I wanted to actually try and dig deeper in terms of, we mentioned a lot of things, or you guys mentioned a lot of things in terms of what it takes to be successful in terms of content, team, things of that nature. But when we look at some games that kind of launch and then just kind of, let's say over 2 to 3 years go to zero, or even 5 years go to zero, and then the kind of games that you guys have been operating, which have been operating for so long, could you talk to us about, what's the secret to this super long growth and the ability to extend these games for such a long time? I was hoping you guys could speak to that. Maybe starting with you, Ken.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to the other answers to the other questions, so I think you take it from a player's perspective. If you are playing a game for multiple years, you obviously really love that game and you enjoy it a lot. And for anything that you do for multiple years, it becomes part of your life in a way. So if you think about it that perspective, as a game developer, providing that service to a player, to a game that has become an integral part of their life, you're going to want to see certain things, so you're going to want to, you're not going to want to get bored. You're not want to do the same thing over and over and over for multiple years. You're going to want it to be new and exciting. You want to anticipate new content. You want to feel like you're a part of a community. You're going to want to feel like you have some sort of impact on the outcome of your gameplay. And I think in the end, you want to get like whatever you call a high quality level of service too. So I think that's also sometimes discounted. So we can think about the mechanical part of, what changes we make to the product, but sometimes we discount the service side of things. So that's, if you're having an issue, well, first, are you running into an issue in the first place? If that's always a bad experience, and if you have too many issues, people are going to churn out of your product no matter how much they love it. Then if they are having an issue, then how quickly can that get resolved? So your support and all that. And then I guess the other one is like, how do they feel if it's a competitive game? Do they feel like they are able to still compete? And I think a lot of competitive games or power games that are based on power, sometimes have a common mistake where they escalate and inflate power too quickly. And the gap between a high-powered player and a medium and low-powered player ends up getting too big. And that can completely ruin the community because, or the game itself and the economy, because if you're a high-powered player, what's fun about it is that you get to beat everybody else. And if you're a mid or lower level player, what's fun is interacting with a lot of people and pretending like you have a chance to win. And so that if you lose all of those different things, then you quickly lose the players that you work so hard to keep in the game for so long. And it's something I think people tend to forget.
Right. So Ken, sounds like what you're saying is essentially that you want to just try to become a part of your players' everyday habits. And maybe there's no secret, but you just have to figure out what are the problems in your game and solve those problems. Is that fair to say? Is that?
Well, we take a holistic approach. It's not just one thing. It's this overall concept of providing a high quality gaming experience, which is not just, giving a good product and a product that keeps evolving. That is one big part of it for sure. But then also making sure that product works really well and that they're not running into issues. And if they are getting issues, that they're being resolved very, very quickly.
Okay. All right, Payton, what's the secret?
Well, I think Ken made some really interesting points there. And I think to what he was saying, it's really important, just as much as the things that you do in a game like this, the things that you don't do are equally important, right? Being very careful not to break the economy within your game, not to break the power balance within your game, listening to your players and knowing, learning over the years how they're going to react to certain changes versus others. I think those are really critical things that keep these kind of games alive, because one poor decision that changes your economy, that can take down a game, right? That can really change the course of its growth, or even just letting a game stagnate, not making enough innovations and just deciding that you're going to coast on its current success. That can easily make you fall out of the competition as the market evolves. So I would say that, that kind of careful attention and being really critical of every decision that you make in a game like this is kind of the key.
All right. And Drew, what's the secret to the Forever franchise?
I've been taking notes. I think I have 6. Payton and Ken touched on a bunch of them. So number 1 is know your players and why they play your game. Your game's been in existence for a lot longer than most games. If you're watching this and sort of taking things away from it, you need to know why they have stayed around for so long. That means talking to them, going and joining your fan pages on social media. Do your homework as a PM on that game, as a designer on that game. Understand what are their pain points, what do they love about your game, what shouldn't you touch, to Payton's point. That sort of gets to the next 2 points. Don't overreact to competition. When your game is 10 years old, there are always going to be people who are coming for your players, coming for your money, coming for your market share. You need to understand, yes, why people who are new to the market are making the decisions that they're making, but you also can't let that drive your roadmap. You can't let that be the thing that causes you to chase every new thing, like what other people are doing is successful, like it's going to apply to your audience. It might not. They might be going after a completely different market slice. You might have nothing to gain from them. You can learn from them, but you might not want to actually put any of what they've got in your game. It might not work for your players. Third, I think Payton touched on this before, push autonomy down to your teams. You need to be able to move quickly, especially when you have sort of more tech debt, more stuff going on, because you're going to be maintaining a lot of things. You're going to need to figure out how to balance maintenance, debt, and net new things. And how you organize your teams is going to become more and more how you get leverage over time. Fourth, Payton also touched on, consider downside, but don't get paralyzed. So a lot of people, when they join a team that has millions of DAU and hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, say, oh, I can revolutionize this, right? I can come up with the next 10x idea. And they learn pretty quickly, yes, those ideas can be good, but they can also lose you way more than they're going to get you. And figuring out how to understand the opportunity cost of that is enormously important when you have so much more that you're starting with. The fifth one is market context changes over time. So what may be true, what your team may know from 7 years ago may not actually be true now. right? The market changes, players change, players learn, right? You work on Deconstructor of Fun. You talk about this all the time as, you know, people and genres change. You've talked about how slots have become a lot more mid-core over the years, right? Slots players are different now than they were 5-10 years ago. And so slots games need to understand how that changes player expectations and ability, the ability of players to really understand what new mechanics or what new game modes you could introduce, because it's going to perform differently. So retest all of that. Think about your mechanics, not just in light of your game, but also in light of the market, because people do play other games. They learn from them. And then last, you're going to have to figure out what debt you pay down, because, you know, any game that was built 10 years ago is not optimized for mobile. And it's not optimized for mobile, not just in terms of the technology, but in terms of how it's designed, in terms of how you can create and implement content, in terms of what tooling is available, in terms of how quickly you can ship features, in terms of, you know, what your processes are for pushing updates. All of those are going to change over time. You need to figure out what kinds of debt you want to pay and when.
Thanks, Drew. That's a great list. And maybe just to follow up a little bit in terms of, because there seems to be a lot of things that, you know, live ops teams should be looking out for. But if you were to highlight maybe the biggest challenge amongst those or other issues that you're seeing, what would you say is like maybe the one or two things that live ops teams should be watching out for or could potentially be the biggest challenge for them?
Definitely knowing your players is the most important. So
okay.
If you don't understand what your players want, and this is a classic of working in games, right? Games makers tend to skew younger, right? It's a young industry, and a lot of people growing up nowadays want to work in games. It's really easy to fall into the trap of making a game that you like. But I don't look anything like the modal player of Words with Friends. The modal player of Words with Friends is a couple dozen years older than me and is most likely a woman, still lives in the United States, but does very different things with their life, is in possession of a very different degree of technical savvy. And so all of those factors matter. They matter in terms of what people want. They matter in terms of what people are going to understand and find intuitive. And if you don't continually learn from your players, talk to them, understand them as human beings, you're going to fail. And so only one lesson, it's definitely know your players inside and out.
And Payton, maybe same question for you in terms of the one or two biggest challenges that live ops teams should be watching out for.
Sure. Yeah. What Drew just said, it wasn't on my original thought on this question, but you know, it's a very, very good point, right? And audience is something that we touch on a lot. We talk about a lot. It is so easy as a developer to say, well, I would like this, so of course the players will like this. And you have to constantly be questioning those kinds of assumptions, especially when, like he said, you're dealing with a group of players that are very distinct, or you're dealing with multiple groups. For instance, in Dragon City, we have a large subset of our players that are also in the older female demographic, but we also have a big subset that are young adult males, right? And so we have to consider both of those audiences distinct play styles and how each of them will react to the features that we develop. Also, just managing a large team and a large project like this, it's a lot of day-to-day operations that can make it hard to kind of zoom out and keep an eye on your higher level goals and making sure that your priorities, not just for next week or next month, but for the next year, 2 years, 5 years, are in order, and that you're constantly you know, balancing those two, the day-to-day operations versus the long-term goals, so that you don't run into that kind of flatline period and you can continue to extend the product life cycle. Okay.
Can go challenges?
I'll take the team side of things. So I think, you know, when you have a product that you're running for so many years, typically you keep that team that was so experienced on that product. And that, you know, that's challenging. If you're working on something for many, many years, it can be a slog sometimes. And especially if you were part of a team that saw it at its peak and then it starts to decline, mentally, emotionally. That can be sometimes hard, and people sometimes don't realize that. And not everybody, especially the people who built the product, not everybody's built to want to run a service. And so I think you end up having different types of game developers and people who want to work on different types of games. People who are very creative and want to develop something new, and versus people who really like breaking down things and optimizing and improving upon what's already there. And I think that is one of the bigger challenges I see in the industry, is that I think a lot of the people that I knew coming in the industry always, they kind of assumed that they would be developing new games and building up something from scratch. And when they have to go in and inherit something that somebody else did, and they have a lot of constraints, that they get frustrated by that. And that can lead to some churn inside of your studio. And losing people on these types of games can be really, really impactful, especially for a game that's been around for a long time. Because games that have been around for 10 years, there's a lot of skeletons in those closets, and a lot of times that knowledge only lives within certain people's heads. And so when you lose somebody, it's really costly, and you end up putting a lot of time and energy into training up a new team or somebody new, or sometimes you just lose information that you're never going to get back again. And this can be quite impactful for an older game.
Is there anything that you do in terms of documentation or anything to help mitigate the loss of kind of inside knowledge issue that you mentioned?
To be honest, not really. There's only so much you can do. You try to create a great documentation culture. But in the end of the day, do you rather have the guys spending all that time writing down every single thing? Because there's always, there's 1,000 things to remember. Most of them are not something that you're gonna remember to document. It's more of I left this, this, when you change this from a 1 to a 0, this happens. If you change this to a 10, this happens. And we do our best to document as much as we can, but there's always stuff that doesn't get documented, especially when you have a product that lasts for so long, because then you have, different versions of different teams that came in that do things slightly differently. And then, have modifications to different tools. So even if you document things in the very beginning, as the product evolves, you have to constantly keep it updated as well. So there's a lot to manage. So I think, best case scenario is that your code documents a lot of stuff for the developers. Designers, there's helpers within these. A lot of times things are done through spreadsheets. So you build tools that are self-explanatory, that allow new people to take them over very easily. So for us, it's less about documentation than it is building tools that allow people to get up to speed quicker.
Got it. So I had one last question for the group here, which is essentially about the type of analysis that you do for, long live operated games relative to newer games. The proportion of your audience is generally going to be, kind of further down the ARPU curve, for example. And so wondering, in terms of the types of analysis or optimization for games that have been live for many, many years, whether that analysis is different for you guys, or maybe it's the same. And maybe starting with you, Drew, could you speak to how you guys do analysis for these longer operated titles?
I would love to. So I used to be a data analyst in a previous life, so this is my jam. So Zynga has this really really consistent framework across all of its games about how it talks about live operations, right? We look at user return rate for people who just started playing in the last week, weren't playing in the last week, but have an account that predates the last week. And people have been playing last week and are playing again this week. And so we call them nurcur and rare. Everyone who's been at Zynga more than 2 days has heard all of those terms more than they really want to hear for the rest of their lives. And so when you talk about new games, right, you talk about ARPU curves, you talk about your hard retention numbers, you talk about sort of your how you project out and whether you're sort of breaking even on user acquisition. To your point, installs aren't the main inflow for people coming into Words with Friends. It's people coming back after having been gone for a while. And so we see very different patterns of our daily inflows, and that has a huge impact on how we consider marketing, how we consider player outreach, how we consider lifecycle campaigns, how we consider push notifications, and even relationships. and how we build features for those different audiences. That doesn't mean that we neglect new users. It's super important to always grow your game, and it's always important, especially as you add more complexity, add more features, that you go back and revisit your new user experience and you say, okay, does this actually teach people how to be successful in the game as it's built today? Because you could have built your new user experience 5 years ago, and it doesn't actually teach people what this game is now. So those are two big things. We also look at sort of the health of relationships and ecosystem health. This is maybe something that's a little bit more niche to Words with Friends, given the nature of the game. But really, how are people getting content? How are people maintaining or not maintaining their relationships with other people? Because we do see that as a really big retention driver and a predictor of success in the game. And then finally, whether your game is a day old or 10 years old, you should always be looking at your CS tickets. You should always be looking at what players are saying to you. You should always be tracking the health of your new releases and looking at your app store. You can always learn from what your players are just willing to volunteer for you.
Payton?
Yeah, again, as usual, Drew touched on a lot of really good points there. For us, I think the very different experience between Words of Friends and Dragon City, obviously, and we have kind of very different player demographics when it comes to our new game users and our late game users in some ways, because a lot of the late game users came from the early Facebook days, and they're an older, more female skewed demographic, whereas a lot of our newer users, like I said, are coming in a little more younger, a little more male skewed. So we approach them in very different ways. I'd say we give pretty equal balance to looking at late game users versus new game users. We're frequently developing, features to try to improve that early funnel, to increase early LTVs and, allow for profitable marketing campaigns and things. We work a lot with YouTubers and things like that are very specifically targeted to our younger, newer audience. But we spend a significant amount of our time creating content and managing the experience of our late game users, because they are so critical in a game like this, and they do make up for 75% of the revenue that we're seeing from the game, right? So we do definitely focus a lot on that, but that is not to say that you should forget the early user experience, because obviously that's what keeps the game alive, right?
Okay. Ken, go, final thoughts?
Yeah, the things that I think weren't mentioned already, I think is you tend to segment, at least for us, we try to segment down a lot clearer into different payer profiles on these older games, and because they have different rates at which they're progressing through the different systems in the games. And so so segmentation down to, different types of users and their paying profiles, and then against the different content systems that you have. So we look at what we call like saturation rates. So if there's an armor system or a certain type of content that people are progressing their way through, you try to figure out what percentage of each of these segments have the most of whatever content that you put out. So you can calculate what is the potential leftover value. And so then you can decide, okay, do I need to produce more, or do I need to create something new for them to do because this is running out? And I guess that is one way you keep track of when is it time to adjust the way that the economy is being driven, or when is it that that's how you can forecast when the revenue is going to start to dip, because people are running out of stuff to do and stuff to buy.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we are out of time. I want to thank the panelists. Thank you very much for your time and insights. And that will conclude How to Operate Games Forever. Hope you are all having a good time here at LevelUp 2021. Thanks, everybody.